Premier Dalton McGuinty's sudden departure leaves many wondering what that means for the nearly $8 billion Queen's Park has promised for transit expansion in the City of Toronto. Joining us now for some insight, John Lorinc, journalist who writes about cities for Spacing Magazine, the Globe and Mail, and the Walrus, and probably lots of others. John, good to have you back here at TVO.
Thanks, Steve.
Let's start by looking at this Mervish-Gary proposal, which has really caused so much buzz around the city. When you first saw it, what did you think?
Well, I thought that it produces an enormous amount of condo units in one very concentrated spot that already has a lot of development activity. And I think that he's looking at a minimum of a decade's worth of sales, and the whole approvals is going to take a while.
But the look of it, did you like it?
I thought it was okay. I think that I need to see more. These are very conceptual drawings, and I've had this experience where these designs evolve over time. So what you see at the beginning is kind of eye candy, and then you get down into more detail as
Meaning
the planning
when the rubber
process
hits the road, some of these things don't really see the light of day. Sometimes.
Yeah, and there are examples where where the initial renderings have included little sort of knickknacks and interesting baubles that are meant to get the attention of the public, and then they sort of are kind of bargained away for other reasons.
What concerns do you have about the truly humongous vertical nature of the redevelopment of downtown that's happening right now?
Well, I think that it creates questions in my mind about the nature of the neighborhoods that we're creating. I mean, we're creating this massive residential neighborhood in downtown Toronto with a lot of predominantly very small condominiums, which in my view are eventually going to become mostly tenant occupied and will probably become quite transient neighborhoods in a couple generations. And I think that we've forgotten the lesson of St. Jamestown, which was built in the 1970s. It was going to be kind of a playground for young and urban people, and it turned into something quite different. And it's a fairly challenging environment for people to live in. It's got lots of newcomers, lots of large families, not a lot of amenities. And I think that we're basically building a lot of that in downtown Toronto.
Yeah, but it would be hard to imagine something David Mervish and Frank Gehry were associated with turning into something like St. Jamestown. Wouldn't you agree?
No, I granted. And so what Mervish will be able to do with that project is charge a premium on the condos that he's selling, because it's got the Gehry imprimatur. And so those will be larger units. They'll be more expensive, more luxury. But up and down Bay Street and in a lot of other places, the Concord development, we have a lot of little shoebox apartments that are quite expensive, that for many people are basically investment vehicles. You create some equity, you move on.
We've heard some estimates that as many as maybe half of those condominiums, if and when they get built, will eventually be lived in by tenants as opposed to the people who own those units. Does that inevitably mean that those units will not be as well tended to and cared for as if the owners themselves lived in them?
Yeah, I think that that's a reasonable expectation. You don't have the same kind of ownership of the property, and I think that it has implications for the amount of capital that the condo corporations can set aside for long-term maintenance.
And the implication of all this is
that that these buildings might get run down. And I mean, you only need to look at the slab buildings that were put up in the 60s around Toronto to see that two generations on, we've got a serious maintenance problem with an awful lot of high-rise buildings, and they need a huge amount of investment. It's not clear where that comes from.
You know that if tenants are watching this right now, they will be saying, what makes you think we're not as good as the people who own those units in terms of taking care of them? Is that a fair argument?
Yeah, I've been a tenant myself, and I mean, some people will take good care of the apartment, some people will take less good care of the apartment. But when it comes to putting out, significant dollars, you're not going to tear out the kitchen and spend $60,000 on a new kitchen. You're not going to make major, repairs to the property because it's not yours. And
conversely, though, why wouldn't an owner want to take good care of his or her investment?
It depends on where the owner is and how closely that owner monitors the property. I mean, if it's, I think a lot of these properties are a place to put currency. It's safe. It's, Toronto's safe, Canada's safe, the Canadian dollar is safe. It's a good investment vehicle.
How safe is it if you let it deteriorate?
Well, it depends on whether you're paying attention to it and how many of those apartments you have in your portfolio. If you bought, dozens of them, you may let a couple of them run down. I don't know. I think the future of these buildings is kind of uncertain because they are very large warehouses full of people who are probably going to move on.
Okay, let me raise another issue with you, and that is this notion of ghettoizing very tall, vertical homes for people. Is that something that concerns you?
Yeah, because I think we talk, as your panel earlier described, we talk a lot about the need for infrastructure, social infrastructure, physical infrastructure, but the city is really not very good at doing that. We don't add park space. You know, can you name a new school that was built in downtown Toronto recently? I mean, there have been a couple of renovations, but we have 100,000 new people living in the downtown, very few children. You know, 20, 30 years from now, maybe we'll have more children, but we won't have any more schools. So we have this mismatch that exists, and I think that the city is very opportunistic in allowing a lot of these very, very high density buildings to go up, but then is not willing to kind of take the next step, which is investing in the infrastructure, because we have this dialogue with ourselves that we don't have money to invest in the city, and we're overtaxed, or we need to constantly cut services and cut taxes and not borrow so much, and so we let the second part of the equation sort of fall to the wayside.
Do you think anybody at the city level is on top of this?
I think the people in the planning department and some of the people on city council understand the dynamic, but I think that it's very difficult to break because we have this conversation. We've been having this conversation in Toronto for a century that we are overtaxed. We don't want to pay more for things, and so we always turn our back on investing in these important infrastructure elements to city building.
What do you think needs to be done to prevent that?
Well, I think that certainly we need more transit. We need, we need more schools and community centers and the type of things that make for a complete neighborhood, which are really missing in some of these buildings and in some of these neighborhoods. So there are these vertical neighborhoods. So you need to kind of fill out the picture. St. Jamestown is a really great example. It was built in the 1970s. It had one tiny little inadequate school. They had portables, tons of portables there. There was, no libraries. There's no community center. It took years and years of political fighting to retrofit that neighborhood, which has thousands of people living in it, with basic amenities that, the Torontonians who live in residential neighborhoods take for granted. And why is that?
Okay, let's take a more laser-like look at the transit issues that are happening as a result of all of these condos going in. Do you think at the moment the city has a transit plan that will adequately deal with the large numbers of people that are going to be moving into these downtown neighborhoods?
Well, we have lots of plans, and we have a regional plan which is called the Big Move, which was prepared by Metrolinx a couple of years ago. We have a plan for the City of Toronto, which is not fully fleshed out, but we understand more or less where the higher order rapid transit has to go. We know that there is enormous pressure on the subway lines, and that you need a relief line.
You should just explain that for people who live outside Toronto, what the relief line means.
So the relief line means that the existing young subway line, the Young University subway line, is increasingly crowded. It's almost impossible to get a seat on that line in the mornings.
Almost impossible to get on it, never mind get a seat.
Yeah, and you can watch trains go by. And so there needs to be a relief valve. And in other cities, you see multiple lines going along a busy corridor like that. We're not going to twin up the Young line like in New York, but we need a relief line. So people have a different route to get into the downtown, and one that's proposed goes down from the Bloor-Danforth line towards Queen Street.
Yeah. Should we do this here? Here's the subway. Okay. Can I show this on what camera can I show this on? Where's 3? Over here. All right. So this is my fancy-dancy map here. That's the Young line. That's the University line over here. There's Bloor. And when you talk about a relief line, you're talking about something that sort of goes like that, right? Almost like a hypotenuse on a triangle. And that gets people...
It's a half a U.
It's a half a U. Okay. Yeah. And that would be, first of all, it's several $100 million and would be a relief on the Yonge Street subway line. We've been talking about that for 30 years.
Yeah, and I think that the number that we have to start using is billions. It's going to be billions of dollars. It's going to take, if they started today, it would take a decade or more to produce this line. And the problem is that there's no money for it. Nobody has said, this is the pot of money that we're going to use, or nobody has said, we're going to borrow this amount of money, pay it off over time, and get this, additional transit amenity that really is very, very much needed.
Okay, John, then let's do what Bob Woodward always says, and that is follow the money. Dalton McGuinty's government has promised billions of dollars for transit developments in Toronto. He's now leaving. Does that mean, he's not leaving for a few months, but he's on his way out. Does that mean that money is in jeopardy right now?
Okay, so Dalton McGuinty has made two broad commitments on transit funds. So he committed $8.4 billion to the construction of 3 light rapid transit lines on Eglinton, Finch, and Shepherd. There was a big fight over that over the last year. The Metrolinx, which is the agency that's responsible for building it, is going through the process of getting these contracts tendered. There's a second piece, which is a 25-year transit expansion vision, basically, that costs $50 billion. It will probably cost more like $80 billion to increase the amount of rapid transit all through the GTA and Hamilton. That piece is unfunded. So they've put a price tag on it, which is going to grow. And they've said, okay, well, we're going to have to come up with revenue tools. Revenue tools is a euphemism for all sorts of taxes.
User fees, taxes, whatever.
Road tolls, whatever.
Yeah.
It's going to mean that you have to pay extra in order to finance the construction of these big transit projects that will help relieve gridlock and traffic congestion in the city. So it's an important, necessary tool, but you're saying to people who have lots of other financial obligations, well, you're going to get taxed more. And that's a very challenging proposition for a lot of people. And I understand that. It's nobody wants to pay more taxes.
So the 50, 60, 70, $80 billion larger plan,
right,
whatever that is, let's set that aside for now. The $8 billion plus that Queen's Park has committed, is there any reason to think that that money won't be forthcoming because the Premier is now leaving?
Well, I think that I think it's a question mark. I think that that train is somewhat out of the station. There have been major purchases of equipment. There's some construction going on one of the lines. But realistically, this is a project that's going to take 10 years to build. And so there's lots of opportunity for course correction, for the changing of the political mind. And we've seen that before. We need only go back to the 1980s when, there was a change of government and a big subway plan that the former Metro Toronto had put forward was canceled, and, only a little portion of it was built. So, I think it's a bit of a question mark. And Tim Hudak, he held a press conference a couple of days ago. He says he's more interested in subways and underground transit than surface transit.
Actually, he was very careful about it. He said, where money is available, we're for subways.
Right. And he's also distinguished between denser urban areas and less dense urban areas. But I think that he's kind of raising a question. And so much depends on the timing of the transition in government. So if the whole leadership process takes a year before we get to a general election, perhaps Metrolinx will be far enough along on its current projects that it'll be too late to sort of turn the clock back. If it happens sooner, maybe Mr. Hudak sees an opportunity to put his own stamp on what he'd like to see in transit.
Got 20 seconds left. One of the things he did say in the news conference that he had, where he talked about all of this, was that he'd like to see Metrolinx running both the larger transit plan and the Toronto Transit Commission, which runs only in the 416 right now, the subways and the rails. You think that's a good idea for Metrolinx to run everything?
Well, I think that there are lots of regional transit authorities, Los Angeles, Vancouver, New York. It's not a bad idea because it brings a certain coherence to it. Mr. Hudak has to talk about money and where the money is going to come from because there are serious investments that need to be made. And so I think the general public doesn't really care which agency is running things. It does care about whether or not there's investment.
Gotcha. John, thanks for coming in tonight.
Thanks,
appreciate your time. John Lorinc.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.